The development of Inscryption started with a game jam project made by indie developer Daniel Mullins. Back in 2018, right when Daniel was done with his second game, The Hex, a popular game jam known as Ludum Dare was about to take place. Daniel's love for rapid game development is no secret, as The Hex and his previous game, Pony Island, were both heavily inspired by some of his earlier game jam projects. Naturally, he was excited to participate in the 43rd edition of Ludum Dare. The theme that year was Sacrifices Must Be Made, and it immediately reminded Daniel of the popular card game Magic the Gathering, which he had recently started playing again. Some of the mechanics of Magic the Gathering involve sacrificing cards to gain advantages, and this sparked an idea for Daniel. What if he created a card game where sacrifices were central to the gameplay? He envisioned a concept where players would have to sacrifice weaker animal cards, like squirrels, in order to summon stronger creatures such as wolves to tip the scales in their favor and secure victory. With only 48 hours to complete the project, not a lot of planning went into the core rules and design choices of the game. The tug-of-war victory condition, the cabin in the woods, the sacrifice mechanic, the evil forest demon sitting across the player, and the lane-based combat were all developed on the fly. Daniel's experience with various collectible card games, which he'd been exposed to growing up, gave him an instinctive understanding of what makes them fun and interesting. As he began piecing the game together, Daniel pushed the concept of sacrificing even further by exploring darker, more imaginative ideas. What if the player had to sacrifice their own body parts during the game? If you cut out your eye, you wouldn't be able to see half of the playing field. If you cut off your hand, how would you continue playing? These unsettling questions began to expand the gameplay and atmosphere, making the game more unique and scary. Daniel used Photoshop to design the cards, while Unity served as a game engine. These two tools later became the primary ones used during the development of Inscryption. After 2 intense days of development, everything came together to form a fun, straightforward card game with a deeply sinister undertone. So sinister, in fact, that Daniel believes the ending is potentially darker than anything that happens in Inscryption. He named the project after the game jam's theme, Sacrifices Must Be Made. It received lots of positive feedback and was voted the second best title of the Ludum Dare game jam. When Daniel made it available to the public on itch.io, where people can still download it today, the game received another wave of positive comments and became its most downloaded itch.io title by far. It was clear that Sacrifices Must Be Made had great potential, but he was unsure how it could be expanded upon to become his next big multi-year project. Initially, Daniel didn't see a way to expand his creepy card game, so his first idea was to make it part of an anthology. He envisioned a trilogy of smaller games, with Sacrifices Must Be Made as the first chapter. Daniel called this project the Carnelian Box, inspired by Valve's The Orange Box. He compared the first game to Portal, as it introduced something new for him, a card game, a genre he hadn't explored before. For the second game, he toyed with the idea of creating a sequel to his previous game, The Hex, similar to how Half-Life 2 was featured in the Orange Box. The third game would have been his equivalent of Team Fortress 2, featuring a competitive online component. Before we move on, I'd like to talk about this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, ranging from beginner to advanced. If you want to become a game developer just like Daniel Mullins, Skillshare is the place to be. It offers classes on how to use game engines like Unity, Godot, or Unreal Engine, as well as learning how to create 3D models in Blender and how to animate them, how to compose video game music, how to write a story for your game, how to come up with a good game idea in the first place. The list goes on. I personally have wanted to dip my toe into game development as well, so I started exploring a Godot class on how to make a 2D platformer, and it's been a great experience. Every class is divided into easy to digest video lessons, making it perfect to tackle each class at your own pace. You're provided with all the resources you need to get started, and once you finish a class, you can even share your own project to get feedback from the community. Of course, there's thousands of other classes taught by industry experts across film, illustration, design, productivity, and more. Skillshare also provides curated sequential class collections called learning paths to master a specific skill or competency. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so join millions of other members today. Skillshare, explore your creativity. Now back to the video. By May 2019, Daniel was focused on fleshing out his first game of his anthology series. While Sacrifices Must Be Made had a small but compelling story, he felt it wouldn't be substantial enough as something that's part of a trilogy. Daniel eventually came up with the idea of giving players a chance to escape from the evil forest demon by gradually collecting items like running shoes, a flashlight, and other survival tools. Players would achieve this by getting up from the card table to explore the cabin they were trapped in. Once enough puzzles in the cabin were solved and the necessary items collected, players could attempt to flee the cabin while the demon chased them. They would need to jump over obstacles in the forest in hopes of obtaining freedom. During this stage of development, the game was known as That Card Cabin. For the card gameplay, Daniel used Slay the Spire as a foundation. While he intended to experiment with more unconventional gameplay mechanics, he knew he could always rely on Slay the Spire's formula of procedurally generated maps, with alternating card picking and card battles, if his experiments didn't pan out. Hearthstone also served as an inspiration, as Daniel considers it as the first digital card game that felt truly exciting to play, largely due to its dynamic animations and satisfying screen shake effects. While the compact story of his game jam project was effective, it felt natural for Daniel to expand on it for That Card Cabin and introduce more lore. He realized that the creepy eyes representing the evil forest demon wouldn't be enough to maintain the player's interest the entire game. There needed to be something or someone behind those eyes. Searching for inspiration, Daniel began googling forest demon. That's when he discovered Leshy, a forest deity from Slavic pagan mythology. After coming across a uniquely haunting painting of Leshy, Daniel knew this figure had to be the game's antagonist. To make the overall story more interesting, Daniel wanted to introduce a mystery for the player to gradually unravel, much like in his previous two games. He began adding elements like talking cards that ask for help, strange nonsensical dialogue, and objects in the cabin that seemed to serve no purpose. The funny thing was, Daniel himself had no idea what any of it meant. He was simply writing cryptic dialogue in the hopes that a larger idea would eventually come to him. Before iterating further on gameplay and story ideas, Daniel wanted to finalize the game's art style. He had learned from his experience with the Hex, where the art style remained in flux for a long time, making development more complicated than necessary. Determined to avoid this with That Card Cabin, Daniel prioritized locking in the visual style early. Since 3D modeling wasn't his expertise, he knew he would have to rely on a freelance artist to create a lot of the game's assets. He wasn't sure yet if he would be able to work with the same artist throughout development. Therefore, to avoid potential conflicts between different 3D artist styles, Daniel decided it would be best to establish a cohesive art style using shaders and post-processing effects, rather than relying on a consistent style for each individual asset. He also wanted to retain the retro aesthetic of Sacrifices Must Be Made while expanding it to better accommodate 3D objects. To explore the visual style he had in mind, Daniel created a mood board featuring games that captured the essence he was aiming for. Around this time, he was also talking to a friend who was working on an indie game titled Brass Bellow, which uses post-processing effects to transform high-resolution 3D objects into pixel art versions of themselves. Inspired by early versions of that game, Daniel began experimenting with similar effects. He reduced his screen resolution by half, from 1080p to a 960 by 540 canvas. This not only created a visually striking aesthetic, but also help mask minor imperfections, such as misaligned textures, normal maps that don't match up in some spots, or less defined shadows. After layering on additional effects, Daniel was satisfied with the overall look. However, he wanted shadows to be even darker, enveloping the entire screen. Daniel's first approach involved using a simple posterization effect combined with a color palette created by one of his friends who has a strong sense of color. The effect forced every pixel to snap to this color palette. While Daniel loved the palette, it caused issues like color banding on brighter parts of the game's assets. Despite this, he was impressed by how the shadows turned out and looked for a compromise. He reached out to Tomasz Tobierski, who developed a shader that checks the brightness of each pixel. The brighter the pixel, the less it locks to the color palette. This solution maintained the dark shadows while preserving enough gradation for finer details. Daniel refers to this effect as posterized with luminance threshold. He continued using the color palette to influence elements like lighting and textures. Once everything was set up and working as Daniel envisioned, it felt like he had unlocked a superpower. He could now take assets he found online, sometimes even for free, drop them into the game without any alterations, and they would automatically match match the retro aesthetic. To test this, he asked his friends to identify which assets were custom-made for the game and which were downloaded from the internet. Most of the time, they couldn't tell. Whether a 3D object originally looked realistic or stylized didn't matter. The post-processing effects made everything conform seamlessly to the game's art style. You might think this approach would limit Daniel's creative freedom, as he couldn't add smaller details to the 3D models, for instance. However, as he mentioned in a GDC talk, the opposite was true. This method allowed him to compose scenes incredibly quickly and instantly determine whether they looked right for the game. For example, when he combined candlesticks with a skull to test how it would look in the game, it took only minutes to see the final result. According to Daniel, working with an artist to achieve the same outcome would have taken days or even weeks. That being said, Daniel still relied heavily on talented artists like David Hageman, the game's main 3D artist, to create tons of custom assets, including characters, props, and more. These custom assets were even more effective because David designed them with the game's post-processing effects in mind. For instance, he added deep creases to Leshy's mask so they would pick up shadows more dramatically and look better when lit. This attention to detail ensured that the assets not only fit the game's aesthetic, but were enhanced by the visual effects. To better immerse the player and create an unsettling atmosphere, Daniel chose to stick with the first-person perspective used in Sacrifices Must Be Made. To push that immersion even further, he decided to eliminate any visible UI elements from the screen. Instead, he implemented diegetic solutions, meaning that everything communicated to the player exists within the game world itself. For example, the scales track the damage taken and dealt, the bell is used to end the turn, totems display their effect on certain cards, and available items are shown on the table. While Daniel was ultimately very happy with the final iteration of the art style, the first-person perspective, and diegetic elements, it did introduce several challenges that required creative solutions. One of the biggest issues was maintaining the readability of the cards. In digital card games like Hearthstone, the UI consists of many elements, and a clear bird's-eye view is typically used to display everything on the table. However, Daniel's choice of a first-person perspective meant that everything had to be really big and clear, especially if it was farther away. Even then, the low resolution caused by the post-processing effects made it difficult to see finer details such as small text. This raised a key question: how would Daniel communicate the card attributes and effects to the player? In physical card games like Magic the Gathering, long text boxes are often necessary to explain complex effects, as players must manually carry out the instructions. Digital card games, however, streamline this by having the computer handle the exact mechanics, so cards only need to convey the general idea of what will happen. In Daniel's case, though, even a small text box was simply not readable. To address this, he came up with the idea of using sigils to represent a card's ability, providing a more visually clear and concise way to communicate the effects. To help players understand what each sigil means, Daniel created a rulebook that could be consulted at any time, allowing for longer descriptions to remain accessible. However, he wanted the sigil descriptions to live in the player's mind. To achieve this, he used a multi-pronged approach. When a card is first introduced, Leshy provides some flavor text, often in the form of a metaphor, to explain the card's ability. When depicting the sigils, Daniel avoided using things like numbers and arrows to depict what a card does, and instead tied the visual representation into Leshy's metaphor. From his experience playing many board games, Daniel knew that literal depictions could become confusing when multiple symbols with numbers and arrows were involved, making the cards feel cluttered. As an example, the sigil for the Stinky effect is represented by a pile of poo with stink lines, a simple and memorable visual. Finding the right difficulty was also a significant challenge. Some playtesters took 20 hours to defeat Leshy, while others breezed through it in just 2 hours. To address this, Daniel looked for ways to modulate the difficulty, ensuring that players who found the game too easy would face more obstacles, while those who struggled could eventually overcome it. He kept tweaking the difficulty right up to the end of development. In late 2019, Daniel started playing the Pokemon trading card game for Game Boy Color on his 2DS. Although he had played it as a child, revisiting it years later as a game developer, he was impressed by how the creators had managed to translate such a complex card game onto a small pixelated screen. Around the same time, he was also playing Shovel Knight, King of Cards. This combination of pixel art games charmed Daniel to such an extent that he now wanted to make a pixel art version of his own game. He felt that this might be the key to unlocking the mystery mystery he was trying to tell in the game and could help drive the story forward. This line of thinking sparked a flood of ideas, more than enough to expand That Card Cabin into a full, standalone game. As a result, Daniel abandoned the idea of creating a trilogy of anthology games. Although he briefly considered keeping the title That Card Cabin, he ultimately decided to change it to Inscryption. The following year was all about developing the second part of Inscryption. In addition to transforming his game into a pixel art version of itself, Daniel saw this as an exciting opportunity to introduce more opponents. This led to the creation of the 4 scribes, inspired by Pokemon gym leaders. If Leshy's type was wilderness, what would the other 3 specialize in? Daniel eventually settled on a robot, an undead character, and a wizard. He admits he's not entirely sure why those choices felt right, but those classic tropes just resonated with him at the time. With Part 2, Daniel aimed to instill 2 formative game experiences from his younger years. The first was something he felt while playing The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time for the first time. He vividly remembers thinking the game would reach its conclusion when young Link pulled out the Master Sword, only to discover that this moment was just the beginning of a much larger adventure. A feeling of awe came over him, shattering all his expectations for what was about to come next. The second experience came from playing card games during his university years. Daniel and his friends played a lot of Magic the Gathering, but occasionally one of them would introduce a new card game, similar to Magic, but different in key ways. They loved cracking open these new games and using their Magic knowledge and terminology to figure them out. Daniel wanted to give players of Inscryption a similar experience. This is why, in Part 2, players must assemble their card decks from scratch, and why they can now crack open card packs. Given Daniel's previous 2 games, he feels there are certain expectations to create something that doesn't just play it straight. In fact, he believes fans would be disappointed if his games turn out to be exactly what they appeared on the surface. The sudden switch from 3D to 2D was a surprising twist he needed to subvert typical game expectations and keep players on their toes. The third and final part of Inscryption returns to the more familiar card gameplay, but in a new 3D setting. Here, the player faces off against one of the other scribes, known as PO3. For a brief moment, Daniel considered giving the remaining 2 scribes a larger role in the game. There was kind of a development constraint. I liked the idea of going back to 3D after the 2D part, and it made sense to have another of the scribes take over, but I just didn't think people had the stomach for 3 more different 3D sections, and I wasn't sure if I did either. I didn't know if I wanted to push this game another year or 2 years to make them. So what I tried to do was have those scribes play a greater role in influencing the events, even if they didn't get as much screen time. Like Remora is the one at the end, obviously spoilers, triggers the deletion of the game. So I guess she has one of the most consequential roles in the story, but her and Magnificus, I just didn't have the will to do a full 3D part for either of them. With a clear vision of the beginning, middle, and end of Inscryption, Daniel still felt that something was missing. The spooky cabin, the pixel art world, and the futuristic factory all felt so different from each other that he thought there needed to be a quote-unquote tortilla to wrap up this burrito of gameplay sections. That's when he came up with the idea of adding a meta-narrative layer told through live-action video. This addition would deepen the mystery, raise the stakes, and tie everything together into a cohesive story. He began talking to actors in late 2020, but didn't start filming until 2021, the same year the game was released. While Daniel had some experience directing amateur films in high school, it didn't prepare him to be a director on a set of his own creation and working with professional actors. Fun fact, Daniel's favorite character is a nameless NPC that the community nicknamed Goobert. Originally, Goobert was meant to play only a small role in Part 2. The idea was that Magnificus tortures his students with ridiculous tests, and Goobert's test was to be turned into goo and live like that for a while. However, both the beta testers and Daniel himself liked Goobert so much that Daniel asked his friend Sean Caremaker to design a 3D version of the character and suggested putting him in a bottle. This led to Goobert making his way into Part 1 and Part 3 as well. Composer Jonas Senzel provided the soundtrack for Inscryption, as he had done for Pony Island and The Hex. It was important for each part of the game to have its own distinctive sound palette and identity, while still maintaining a consistent tone of creepiness and otherworldliness throughout. Daniel would usually send Jonah a reference track to give him an idea of the mood he was aiming for, but beyond that, Jonah was given the freedom and time to experiment. Sometimes, when Daniel was stuck designing an area, he would ask Jonah to compose a short track to inspire him and help him finish it. This collaborative process kept their working relationship both fun and challenging. While composing tracks for Part 2, Pokémon was a major influence. Jonah received the Lavender Town theme as a reference, aiming to capture its vibe, which he described as quote-unquote unsettling and weird, yet kind of satisfying and cozy. It's not horror, but there's an odd, melancholy creepiness. The final year of development was an extremely busy period for Daniel. Development on Part 3 didn't even begin until early 2021, and at the same time he was shooting, directing and editing all the live action scenes. He also started talks with Devolver Digital to see if they were interested in publishing the game. Once they officially became partners, Daniel gained access to professional QA testers and a talented team that produced high-quality trailers. This partnership also made console ports a reality. After 3 years of development, Inscryption was released in October 2021 and was met with critical acclaim. Polygon even named it their best game of 2021. Unsurprisingly, it was nominated for numerous awards and won several, including Game of the Year at the Game Developers' Choice Awards, and every category it was nominated for at the Independent Games Festival Awards. In 2022, Daniel released a free update featuring a mini expansion called Casey's Mod. This mode allows players to enjoy the card game from Part 1 endlessly, something fans had been requesting since the game's release. The expansion includes new challenges, cards, abilities, and even expands the overall story. As of this video's release, Daniel is working on Pony Island 2: Panda Circus. Described as a phantasmagorical voyage through time, myth, divinity, and video games, this may be Daniel's wildest project yet. Interestingly, after Inscryption's release, Daniel mentioned in an interview with Digitally Downloaded that he had noticed recurring patterns in his work, such as untrustworthy characters who speak directly to the player, characters who are aware they are in a video game, and intentional glitches and bugs. However, he hopes his approach to game development continues to evolve over time, and that his future work reflects this growth. Pony Island 2 might therefore offer something very different from what we've come to expect from a Daniel Mullins game. I, for one, am looking forward to it.